Okay, good evening. We'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, I'm Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our LaRouche PAC Strategic Overview for Monday, November 14th. I'm going to be joined by Michael Stager. And just to start with a few developments, opening developments, before I turn it over to Mike for his comments and for discussion afterwards, after Michael's opening remarks, we'll go to reports from all of you joining us on this call. As people know, we have just completed, and those who were on the call on last Wednesday, our special after the elections broadcast that we did and report with Barbara Boyd and also with Bruce Director and Michael Stager. We want to continue that discussion, but we want to take this a little bit more in depth in terms of where we are. Obviously, this election process has been a complete fiasco. And the way to describe where we are is we can talk about the election irregularities, the fraud, all of the things that people are concerned about, but we need to get deeper into what this fight is truly about. And we are in a fight for the soul of our republic. This is an attack on our constitutional republic that we're undergoing. And the fact of the matter is that if we look around the country right now, people are mad as hell. I'll just put it that way, and are ready to fight. I think the recent tweet by Josh Hawley, Senator Josh Hawley, really captures the fight that we're in the middle of when he said that the old party is dead, time to bury it and build something new. Now, that's absolutely what LaRouche PAC has been in the center of when we've called for the revival of a third American revolution. And what I'm going to show in just a second here is the initiative that we have taken on for how we actually build out of this crisis to develop this concept of a third American revolution, but also the idea that when we look at what has just transpired in these recent elections, there's many things that we can talk about in terms of what's going on in battleground states, what's happening around the fact that you have lawsuits being filed across the country, that some states still have their election hanging in limbo, ballots aren't being counted. And the question is that, you know, this idea of what happened to the red wave is obviously a question on people's minds, but we have to talk about why there has to be a strategy for building for the future. And it shouldn't be unstated that the fact that this whole operation is a continuation and has been a continuation of the attack on President Trump, the attack on the MAGA movement, and the attack on our constitutional republic. Because as we're talking right now, many people will see that we are writing reports up detailing what the strategy is for destroying our Constitution coming out of the Davos Forum, World Economic Forum, the Green Agenda. President Trump recognizes this. He has stated that part of the problem with the Republican Party apparatus, particularly those who are controlling the Republican Party, the uniparty as we call it, the establishment. What was their problem? It's that they went along or continuing to go along with with pushing the green agenda or not fighting against the green agenda and not building an economic recovery program. So now, just a couple of things I want Michael to comment on as well in terms of strategic overview. There was, in our discussions earlier today, there was discussion about, I just want to bring this up in context around, obviously, the question of what needs to be done to address the irregularities, fraud, all kinds of operations around the election is real, and we are directly in the center of this. There was a report that was put out by the conservative treehouse. It was brought up in earlier discussions that we were having. The modern electioneering process of, quote, ballot submission assistance, in quote, is taking center stage. And, this came out in terms of discussing the fact that Democrats in this election process have been functioning by ballot collection rather than votes. And basically, it indicates how the voter rolls have been pumped up, tampered with, in order to qualify people who are not actually qualified to vote. And one of the examples it gave is going back to after the Obama administration and Eric Holder's role, the former attorney general there, that in example in California, that Eric Holder and that process made it legal or made it possible for, as there in California, some of our members will tell you, or people who live there will know, that anyone who can get a driver's license, anyone can get a driver's license, including people who are not citizens. And so anyone who has a driver's license can automatically be put on the voter rolls. So these are part of the problems. I'll tell you, here in Texas, I know I was just listening to a press conference where in Harris County and many counties, but Harris County, one of the largest counties in the country, has just filed a lawsuit, 20-page lawsuit against the election administrator because of the fact that we didn't have paper for the ballots in many of the areas. So all of these things are going on. Now, how do we take this on? Obviously, there needs to be investigations, but we have to wage a much bigger fight. And this is what we're going to talk about also in this context. And this bigger fight is introduced in the new platform, should we say, or new initiative that LaRouche PAC has just put out. And I will see if I can pull this up here. This is the key to turning this whole situation around and taking back our republic. As we call it, the introduction of Project Prometheus, take back the nation for MAGA and for the future. That's our objective right now. As people know, I have a pin on here. President Trump is going to make an announcement tomorrow. We don't know exactly what he's going to say, but one thing is we have to be prepared to mobilize our forces to take charge of the nation again, and to recognize the Republican Party has a major role to play right now. And not just the Republican Party, but the new MAGA movement of Trump, and what LaRouche PAC and Lyndon LaRouche has identified long before in terms of our new initiative here plays a critical role. Introducing Project Prometheus, making the leap to the future, build a 2024 MAGA shockwave in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. I'm going to put this in the chat if people have not had a chance to read it. This platform we lay out is extremely important because the key to it is a nuclear renaissance, and this idea of a nuclear renaissance, we're going to be developing more in our entire website platform, number of discussions around this, what it means to develop the capabilities for advancing every single sector of our economy. And this gets to a number of questions too, which I'm sure Michael is going to take up, which people are talking about across the board. Where was the failure as well when it comes to the younger people in addressing the Generation Z, addressing the fact that there was something missed, and a number of people are recognizing this with the young people and the Republican Party. And the question is the future. What was laid out in terms of a future orientation plan? And we have to correct this immediately. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael for his feedback and comments on on that and what else he wants to say.
Thanks, Keisha. So good evening. I think Keisha laid it out in a pretty effective way. The election is still ongoing. Here we are a week later. If you go back to 1976, Lyndon LaRouche waged his first presidential campaign, and he did a half-an-hour primetime intervention. And it's been noted this was during a time when there were only 3 broadcast stations. So prime time, I think it might have been 10 or 11 o'clock at night, but that's Eastern time. And one of the things he stated there, when he went through the danger of the Jimmy Carter administration, the trilateral program, the risk of nuclear war, the outright policy of austerity, of depopulation, and especially the developing sector, he talked about vote fraud. And he specifically mentioned California using illegal immigrants to basically build up the vote. Now, the point today is that they realized, and this is somewhat funny, I was in California when this shift took place, but after the Diebold voting corruption in 2004, they said paper ballots, paper ballots, paper ballots. And you said, oh, well, that's surprising. California is going to go with all paper ballots. That's really interesting. No machine counting at all or voting at all. And then you soon to come find out that everybody's starting to mail in ballots. And this really did increase in 2018. This is what Barbara Boyd notes in her write-up that Keisha just posted. Holder was deployed as legal advice and actually helped to make sure that everybody who got a driver's license or an ID or food stamps or disability or housing aid, any kind of government program or government license was basically registered to vote in some way, regardless if they were legal to vote, wanted to be registered. And the point is that it doesn't require voters. You don't need, with massive printing of ballots so that you're printing nearly, if not more, nearly 1 ballot for every person. You're creating an ability that you don't need to get voters to the polls, you need to get ballots cast. And they can be cast in the dark of night, in the privacy of one's own home. In some cases, in California at least, you could even print your own ballot. So you're really talking about just harvesting ballots, not getting voters, individuals, to make a sacrifice to go to the poll because they're concerned about their nation, their state, their county, their school board, and they want to take the time to make sure they can get out and do it. But that you now have these ballots all over the place, kind of swimming in ballots. So for that reason alone, we have this perpetual process. Oh, but we have so many ballots that came in, now we have to count them. It's like, well, how would you count them if everybody cast them? Oh, we've got to open up the envelope and sort it out and make sure this and make sure that. It just added a huge bureaucracy. I spent a day training in Detroit, watching these mail-in ballots and how they were going to process them. I left infuriated and couldn't contemplate any solution but just getting rid of all mail-in ballots. That's a great solution. If we take power and pass federal legislation that dictates how federal elections have to occur, that's all possible. but clearly the question is, how do you overcome this kind of systematic kind of corruption? And this really gets to the point of, regardless of what happens here, what you see to a large extent, one is that more Republicans voted than Democrats. You had more Republican votes. Republicans, you could say, won the popular vote in this election. Okay, well, why? Well, for all the reasons that was stated, that the 75–80% of people think the nation is going in the wrong direction. But again, as with the presidency, popular votes don't win the election. Our system of elections, our system of politics, our system of a republic means that different entities, in this case, the limited sovereignty of the states, play a distinct role. And they also have an executive branch and governors and statewide elections. And in each of those are somewhat different. And there was no effort made. Keisha, can you turn the chat box off? I'm just getting too many chats. People can jump in into the Q&A or jump into the, later. We can't respond to these right now. Sorry. So the bigger question is not the ballots or all the corruption. The bigger question is what strategy exists for the Republican Party to manifest. In this case, the Republican Party, we're attempting to take that party over. There's clearly a fight for the Republican Party. There's a possibility that McConnell will be tossed out. He should be. McCarthy should be challenged. The House Freedom Caucus wants to get back to normal operating procedure, meaning you have limited specific funding bills that go through committees. You have hearings, you discuss the proposal, you discuss the funding. You don't have these omnibus packages of continuing resolutions where nothing ever gets eliminated from the budget. It just rolls over with a few additions every single cycle, let alone all of the bloated inflationary packages that this Biden collective passed in the last year. But where was the actual message or leadership to take each of these states on, which have distinct requirements? The young people were bamboozled, voting for a $50,000 promise from the federal government. We're going to wipe out your student debt. That's a pretty big promise. If you're on a campus or just off a campus, I can guarantee you, if you heard the government was going to, if you voted Democrat, was going to wipe out your student debt, you'd go vote. And they did in large number. And the problem is, over the last 30 years, even 20 years, we've just been creating more and more universities because it's a boondoggle that's been created. So then you got the abortion question. Roe v. Wade was a horrible Supreme Court decision. But over 50 years since Roe v. Wade was decided, the marketing agenda of this radical left or radical British program, which is really what it is, a radical liberal program, has convinced people that abortion is intrinsic in the Declaration of Independence, that it's a God-given right, with no sense of what the principle is. It's just a right. So you've got young women. Republicans won married women as a category. They won most categories. They lost young people under 30 and single women. But this question of it's a right, this is government tyranny that's coming in to shape the discussion. It's been a heavy brainwashing and marketing agenda where there's not strong family structures. And you're not going to win by just campaigning on that. And you are never going to win this country back on social issues. Social issues, it'd be like a doctor just treating all of your symptoms and never getting at the intrinsic cause. And this is where we get at the deeper question, why we're in a position today to build the strongest, most powerful movement in American history. Because everything I've just stated may be true. There may be additions people want to make. There may be aspects that have to be addressed. I think that's absolutely true. But the most important question is, how do we build the strongest, most universal coalition where people of religious faith and anti-war activists and military veterans and blue-collar families and people in the inner cities and immigrants and the elderly and young people and farmers are brought together in a kind of coalition that will overwhelm the kind of corruption that has been a mainstay, not just in these last two elections, but over 30, 40, 50 years. A deeper corruption, which is really the point of why President Trump has become such an important political figure and why his announcement tomorrow night, likely to be the announcement of his 2024 presidential campaign, doesn't come too soon. He's absolutely right to vector this process directly now, to shape a dynamic, to help start to build this movement, because he brought out voters the Republican Party didn't bring out. Now, Josh Hawley and Rick Scott and Ted Cruz and Ron Johnson, who won a tough battle in Wisconsin. A number of Republican senators are calling for McConnell to step down, postpone the leadership race until after the Georgia special election, despite the fact now that it looks like the Democrats have held the Senate. The real question is, how do we participate in building that kind of movement? Now, of course, it's all the activity. It's all the precinct delegates, the grassroots groups. A lot of these people are going to be battered and bruised. You always are after a tough battle and fight. But they're going to shake off those bruises, and battered bruises and wounds are going to heal. And they're going to realize we've got a nation to pull together. We've got a civilization to save. And to a large extent, the Democratic Party, and you could even say more broadly, the Uniparty, because the biggest backers of Ron DeSantis, just to make a quick footnote, are the hardcore hedge fund, private equity, Wall Street crowd. It's the same people backing McCarthy and McConnell. And that's a big reason why they didn't fight. They didn't intend to fight. They didn't intend to win this election. Well, if you looked at this election, you'd say the first thing we have to do is take the House and disrupt the DC program of insanity from this Biden radical left agenda. But you would say, secondly, we've got to make sure we secure some of these states' executive departments, especially in the Midwest. There was no attempt. In Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, there was zero attempt to back up these candidacies, which could have won had they had a clear message. The same is true in Arizona. These candidates were left to face $30 million advertisement campaigns, just destroying them in the popular mindset and whipping up a kind of a sense that this is a radical right-wing terrorist network, election denier, COVID denier, everything. Religious authoritarian government that's going to take away your basic feminine rights. This was the picture they painted for months, with tens of millions of dollars in each state, largely from the crypto thing that just blew out. That was a big part of it. But what did the Republican Party have? They had the albatross of the Ukraine war. There was no distinction. I mean, there was a slight mention a few weeks before the election, but in general, for months, for nearly 8 months, the Republican Party had stood on massive tens of billions of dollars to the so-called 51st state of the United States called Ukraine. There was more commitment to Ukraine than any state in the country. There was more commitment to passing Biden's Green New Deal than there was from any Republican in the House or Senate, at least in any measurable, significant terms, than there was for Trump's infrastructure plan, which was actual hard steel and concrete infrastructure projects. So there was no vision. There's no commitment. There's no project to build. There's no sense that, yeah, we may think that each baby is important, regardless of what stage of development that baby's in. Every single baby is important. But if you're actually campaigning for a viable future, people will have a reason to vote. Just voting against the Democrats may work for some people, but for a lot of people, their default is to vote against the Republicans. You've got to change the matrix of merely voting for the lesser of two evils, because that splits about 50-50 in this country. And it splits 50-50 in a lot of the areas that were formerly industrialized. And this is kind of expanding to certain new areas like Georgia and Arizona and Nevada. And we picked up the one seat that flipped was the Nevada governor's race. But there was really no clear message. And for a lot of the grassroots activists out there, for you on this call, you listening to YouTube, we've got to take a step and look at, as much as these social issues that are so near and dear to the hearts of many people, obviously the transgender and education thing, and many of these opened up new networks. The Muslim community in Michigan, in some precincts in Dearborn, 40-point swing of voters from that voted Democrat, 40-point swing to voting Republican. We saw what happened in Miami-Dade and Palm Beach counties in Florida. They went Republican. Hispanics generally moved massively to the Republican Party, even penetrating into some of these inner cities. Here in Michigan and Detroit, there were candidates that actually went in and campaigned hard. You don't convince people who are incredibly skeptical on one turn to come out and vote, to trust you. But many of these constituents or demographic groups who aren't monolithic, but have certain characteristics, are desperate for someone to come and really fight for them. And if they don't get that, they will vote by default out of fear, because in many cases, the Democratic Party offers massive bribery. They hand out a lot of money. They're the party that will hand out money from the government. I mean, it's scraps from the table for what the Democratic Party is actually doing, with trillions of dollars going into the largest corporations on the planet for war, for internet surveillance, police state surveillance, for speculation, for green energy obsessions. But it scraps off the table. But nonetheless, for people that are fighting to survive, they'll vote for it. But a large majority want to fight for a viable, real future. They want meaning to their life and a purpose. This is the intrinsic question. And the social issues, like abortion, which is perhaps one of the biggest, or even gun rights, these are critical. I mean, you can't take away people's guns and expect to hold the government in check. Even Machiavelli 500 years ago knew that. But the question is different. You've got to mobilize people around what we're going to create as a viable, long-term future. At a crisis juncture like this, and this is a real historic crisis. Look at the energy collapse, production collapse, potential food collapse, rising in prices, massive money printing, complete blowouts of certain financial sectors. This will only continue. The threat of an expanded war in Europe. All of these factors demonstrate that we're at a point where the post-war system has come to an end. If Russia, which is likely to run as soon as the ground really freezes in Ukraine, right now it's 40 and rainy practically every day in Ukraine. You're not mobilizing tanks and huge hundreds of thousands of troops to be mobilized across that territory on open fields in the mud of 40-degree rain. When that ground freezes, the best analysts that are watching this say Russia will then take its special military operation and escalate it on a new stage, given the fact that it's called up hundreds of thousands of troops. Well, NATO has put itself on the line. I mean, the head of NATO said, if Ukraine loses, NATO loses. This is really not just about Ukraine or about crypto or the energy supply. It's about the very structure, this neoliberal structure of the post-war World War II system, that it itself has failed. And that means we have to replace it with something different. That constant handouts from the government, though may be necessary, and this was true even during COVID, though may be necessary, printing money, handing out money, doesn't solve the problem of a lack of food, housing supply, fuel supply, productive jobs and employments, places to raise families, affordable housing. You can't print money and solve those. You actually have to build more housing, more energy, more schools, cultural events, infrastructure, industrial platforms. So as much as that short-term survival, which has been ongoing for decades, really since the dot-com bubble and massive hyperinflationary developments in the market led to massive expansion of government handouts, printing money from the Federal Reserve, which went nuts during COVID, 6 trillion in new notes just in COVID. We've reached the end of that agenda. The incremental benefit from each new handout or round of printing, regardless if they're raising rates or not, it doesn't matter. Each new round of printing or money of handouts gets you less and less each handout. Increasingly, a majority of the American people can read the writing on the wall. How do we get out of this crisis? This is what Mr. LaRouche would describe as a conjunctural breakdown. This system has to be overhauled. It's not tweaked. It's not repaired. You need to reestablish a system. And you don't bring in lawyers and bankers to do that. You bring in builders. You bring in engineers. You bring in the industry. You bring in the heavy manufacturing. You bring in the farmers. You look at bringing the people of mining and exploration of new resources. You bring in your space program and space exploration teams. You say, how do we begin to quickly and rapidly advance the production of the country? And we will build a system that facilitates that process. That's the potential of Trump's 2024 campaign. He is by nature a builder. He sees himself in that light. We see other people that are similar that he can bring into the program. And it's that kind of commitment to say this system is done. We're going to build our way out of it. Our first priority is to maintain the livelihood of our people. The idea that Republicans put out, this was from policy committees inside the House, this came from McConnell and some senators, that they were going to cut Social Security and Medicare or reform it. The very threat of austerity towards your people is psychotic at a breakdown crisis. The first commitment is to make sure we keep people alive, no matter what it takes. Whether you have to give, you federalize healthcare for the time being. Whatever it is, you make sure people have food, they have fuel, they have healthcare, there's education, they have some kind of work to do. These were the emergency steps that we took in the Great Depression, but they aren't the solution. They're just what's required for the government to maintain the faith and commitment of its people. We then have to rapidly expand the industrial base, the scientific base. And what Trump has shown in his first term is a remarkable capability to move in this direction. What he lacked then was the movement that we have possible today. And this really is the defining factor. These next 2 years are the most critical of any of our lives. Because once this point has been reached, the complete collapse, Biden has practically pissed off every country regarding his foreign policy, let alone his gaffes. The whole foreign policy is a disaster. NATO is bankrupt. NATO is now leading us into a war, not preventing one in any way. It's not preventing nuclear war, it's causing one. The entire central banking system has shown itself to be incompetent to deal with either employment or inflation. We have a complete breakdown of infrastructure, much of which was built 75 years ago in our country. We've got to now do something fundamentally different. And if that option, this kind of viable option, what we're calling Project Prometheus of a nuclear renaissance, because of how much that requires a full mobilization of new industries or to establish the industries necessary to build the nuclear power plants. And Brian Lance, who's done a lot of reporting on this, is going to come out with some publications on our website. There's good breakthroughs, important ones. Things like we are finally getting back to forging the kind of pressure vessels necessary to build a nuclear power plant from start to finish. We haven't had that for decades. So there are major processes already put into motion that we're going to fill out on our website. We're going to educate you on so that you know this stuff in depth. This is the way that if you're going to win a war, you have a strategic vision. As Lincoln said, 2 things the Confederacy has to commit to. You'll join the Union and respect it and never leave it, and you abolish the institution of slavery or accept its abolishment. After that, Lincoln said, these are the commitments. Our commitments are even more economic in its importance. But that's what's really been shown necessary. We have a number of people who have been hardened and tested by the last 2 years. We have an election integrity agenda, which is far more fierce and thorough and on top of their game than we did 2 years ago. They are scrutinizing the mistakes and illegalities of the current operation. We're going to see court actions. We're going to see mobilizations. We're going to see the kinds of steps necessary to make sure that we can hold as fair of an election as possible in the coming 2 years. There's going to be some problems. But if you have the kind of force to hold things to the sunlight, and you have a mobilization of a population towards a real future, we can overwhelm their corruption. And they're going to hold the bag on a collapsing system. We have to hold the clear pathway towards a real viable future. That's never been more starkly clear. And if we have that, the American people are going to respond. They're not going fascist. All the attempts at media control, all the attempts at demonizing Trump, the J6, the J6 hearings, the DOJ Mar-a-Lago raid, the putting in imprisonment number of Trump allies, raiding people, FBI raiding people's homes in the dark of morning, all these steps, all these fascist Stasi steps, massive media lies. The Nazis and the Stasi are blush with envy. And yet more Americans came out and gave a big middle finger to that entire operation than didn't. We aren't a nation tended towards fascism. We have strong spines and broad shoulders. But we have to enlighten the mind of how we're going to build our way out of this real crisis. And I think if we do, I have total confidence in the hearts and minds of the American people to jump on board and to rally. So that's what our commitment is. That's where I think the stage of this war is after this very intense battle. And I think if we do that, we'll capture the hearts and minds of not just the people that are already fighting, but a lot of the young people, especially the space program, especially fusion energy. But these are, I think, the possibilities. So Keisha, I'll leave my comments there, and I guess we'll find out what other people are thinking.
Yep. Excuse me. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to follow up because I think the final comments that you were making, just in terms of this commitment to building a future and where the young people have to play a critical role in the responsibility of the Republican Party. I was thinking about this today. I mean, obviously, as we've said, Brian Lance, my colleague here, our colleague in Texas, has written quite a bit of material on how we build out this nuclear renaissance, what the materials, the steel production, what would be needed. But the question is where are you going to get the labor force, the workforce? And this is where, the question of the space CCC really takes on a whole nother level with this nuclear renaissance. And you think about, I would even propose going space CCC, when you think about where the critical role back during the Civilian Conservation Corps of not just training up a generation of workers, but you had to have a total cultural transformation. These young people were taken out of the dung heaps of, the bad cultural environment. They were given major training. And, you think about what we're facing today. It's not just, well, did we make a mistake on not being cool with the young people around abortion policies? The question is the future. What are they actually participating in? And when you think about what the Republican role in developing a new, as Brian called it, a space CCC or Civilian Conservation Corps or even AmeriCorps project, we might even want to go even further and call it a MAGA Corps, because
we'll call it a Civilian Exploration Corps.
Civilian exploration, because the space program is going to be fundamental, because we're not just talking about sending people into space, but we're talking about building out our economic platform. But the other important point in this is, remember what we've been talking about and what's become very apparent to people in terms of the targeting of young people, 18 to 35-year-olds, the numbers of people who are losing their lives due to the fentanyl crisis, due to the border crisis. If we don't fix this, I mean, you think you had a number of young people coming out to vote, but this is what they should have been mobilized around. Our generation, is dying, is being destroyed. What's the future that we have? And we have to mobilize them around the future they have to be fighting for. So this question of the nuclear renaissance, and not just, we're going to put up a few nuclear power plants here and there, but this is a transformation of our human identity, how we're going to build out the next generation of, this question of the family formation, how we're going to make sure that these young people have the opportunity to have families, a single income household. But all of this is around this very question of, one, the commitment to human life, which is important given this fentanyl crisis, but also the commitment to giving people a sense of mission and participating in building our nation. So I think that's where and young people can really get motivated and inspired by. And question is, people are talking about, well, we messed up with the young people. How are we going to reach them? And how are Republicans going to reach them? I may be wrong, but I think that that's going to be a strategy that's going to be extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, this younger generation, I mean, it stood out with Trump's first term and campaign, for Trump's first campaign especially. Even the reference to MAGA, Make America Great Again. For people under 35, especially under 30, they've grown up in a post 9/11, post forever, in a state of forever wars, massive financial bailouts, while their own families saw their parents go bankrupt with their home foreclosed, and all the other economic breakdown. And then the drug policy has been massive legalization. The universities have been increasingly dumbed down, education generally, the climate cult. So I think there's a certain characteristic to this political dynamic, which I think the young people were mobilized to vote. The bribery around forgiveness of debt is a huge thing. You know it, Keisha, I know it. Like young people, it's funny because there was a court decision and it was just upheld in appellate court today or yesterday that there's no way, this is totally unconstitutional. It's a complete breach of separation of powers. But yet it was dangled enough to have a mobilization of an election. In the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, it was left to be a votes on the states. We said let it be voted on in the states. Well, 50 years after Roe v. Wade was decided, our culture's become so liberal and so much about individual rights rather than what are we accomplishing, where are we going in society, that people have been mobilized to vote. But they're not going to have that kind of reflex issue. They've spent that reflex program, just like they used up all of their mainstream media to blast Donald Trump nonstop for 4 years and expose that to be just a radical political agenda. So the thing that stands out in me is, are the adults in this society really going to mobilize around a future for the young people? If we see that, if we see the people over 35, 40 plus say we've got to create a future for these young people and build it, then I think they're going to be like, oh, wait a minute. You mean maybe all of this stuff is junk? Maybe this whole thing is rotten? Yeah, I mean, that's what I kind of thought. I thought maybe we could tear it all down by shutting down the gas stations. But maybe you're right. Maybe a better way is to shut down the bastards who have been running this and actually bring to bear a pro-people, pro-growth agenda. And to make it exciting, to make it about new technologies like fusion, to make it about things like space exploration, and about collaborating with other nations around development. So I think if we can get this message, then we can awaken the hearts and minds of young people, because let's be honest, the older generation among us, the post-war boomer generation, they saw people like John and Robert Kennedy fight. They saw people like Martin Luther King, and a generation older than them, actually out-leading movements. They eventually saw Lyndon LaRouche, who kind of picked up in the wake of those assassinations to lead a powerful movement in American politics. they were given a sense that you could get out and do something and change the course of a process in a positive way. All of that has been now twisted into the darkest, most cynical and sadistic policies. But if we give real leadership, I think the younger generation will rise very quickly. And it's not hard to imagine that an interesting, productive job in manufacturing or industry with decent pay, good health care, a pension, things that like come along with like productive work, that a lot of young people are going to be like, that sounds fun. And if you bring young people into these manufacturing centers, these are high-tech stuff. We're going to need all of their computer literacy and ability to deal with, computer systems and software. I mean, all of that's required for advanced manufacturing and production today. They're going to find it exhilarating. But I don't think it's about just, doing tours in high school to get them engaged. I think we've got to see this kind of political movement realize we can rescue them. And in doing so, we will revive the idea of the true United States, of the real responsibilities of self-government, not just in the young people, but in the broad sweep of American culture today. That's why this question of how you build a future, what's required, is the most essential factor to making sure as this movement grows in the wake of this election towards 2024, that this concept is at the forefront of what we're doing, because it will make the difference of kind of not just securing an election, because that's not really what we've got to do. We've got to resecure a country. And that means we have to secure this election in a way that brings in and inspires in the minds of people a different sense of what they're actually a part of. And from that, I think we will build a move. From that standpoint, I think we will inspire a movement of young people to then take on the leadership responsibilities for the coming generations.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I'm going to ask Susan to hop in here. I think she's on too.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to throw in a few things, since our project Prometheus is focusing not exclusively, but importantly on 3 states, which is Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, because those were 3 critical states in 2016 for Trump's victory. And of course, the Democrats are now patting themselves on the back that they've erected the blue wall in these 3 states. So I wanted to just give people a preliminary report in terms of the kinds of responses we began to get in Michigan to this new initiative. My husband and I were able to go to an event on Saturday night, which was a pretty big gathering of pro-Trump activists, leaders, and others. And the first thing that we sort of had to address with people is what really happened. Because if you sit there thinking this had something to do with Democrats versus Republicans, people were just on the floor. But when you look at it from the standpoint of what it really was, which is Donald Trump and the MAGA movement against everybody. People have probably seen the T-shirts and the sweatshirts in our area, which is Detroit versus everybody. Well, it really was MAGA versus everybody. And it was really the first, as Mike mentioned, it was like the first battle that many of these grassroots activists were really engaged in. Not like 2020 where they went to a lot of rallies, but this was a battle where people went out and they fought, their hearts out for weeks and weeks and weeks for their individual candidates, for the state slate, and for the other battles that we had. And they've come out of it recognizing what they implicitly knew, or they gave, in a sense, they gave lip service to, and I don't mean that facetiously, to the fact that there is a uniparty, that the Republican Party establishment, the Michigan GOP, did absolutely nothing, and frankly, probably did worse than absolutely nothing in terms of backing up the the new candidates who were running up and down the ticket, people who had never run for office before. So people, it sort of occurred to me that this is like George Washington with his troops at the Battle of Manhattan or Harlem Heights. You know, it was their first time really on the ground engaging the enemy. And frankly, from the standpoint of what we were up against, it's not bleak as people were tending to think, because when you look at the election results here in Michigan, we not only did not defeat the incumbent Democrats who holds the statewide offices, but we lost the state Senate and the state House, so that for the first time in 40 years, the Democrats have complete control of this state, which is frankly pretty terrifying on one level. So it's understandable why people are reacting deeply and emotionally to it. But when you assess it from the standpoint of what is the battle really about? The battle is creating, as Mike said, a force, a capability that can win the war, and to redefine the war for what it is, which is not against some, disgusting Democratic Party or witch-like candidates, which we had here and which we still have here in state office, but rather, what do we have on the ground now that can actually challenge a dying global financial system? And when you look at it from that standpoint, we now have a battle-tested army on the ground here. And frankly, we have a hell of an officer corps, because almost all of the candidates, especially the Trump-backed and the America First-backed candidates, this was their first time out. There were people who weren't political their entire lives until 2 years ago, who ran for office, mobilized constituencies, changed the political geometry. One of the places that happened was Dearborn, as Mike was mentioning. Some of the candidates who played a critical role in beginning to shift this geometry were not political until COVID and the 2020 election. And now they're finding themselves leaders of entire movements. So we have, in a sense, we've got an officer corps. What was missing was an actual strategy for victory, that is, victory against this global elite. And when we were talking to people at this gathering on Saturday night, and we began to outline, what is the enemy's weak flank? Well, their weak flank is their economic system is collapsing and it's killing people. And that if we go on the offensive, as you all have been talking about, with an aggressive, an optimistic program for the future, we will take the fight to them, as opposed to, as many people were reflecting, we fought on their territory in this election and they controlled the territory. The one other thing that I would mention is I've been surprised over the past number of days, the number of Republicans or conservatives, including some young people that I've been talking to, who keep describing Donald Trump as a Kennedy Democrat, which is something that we pushed back in the 2020 election, when we campaigned in the last few days of the election with a big banner that said Donald Trump, the best Democrat since JFK. But as we outline this project Prometheus, and a nuclear renaissance and a space program, and compared it to what Kennedy did, you could see the light bulb going on in people's minds that this is how you actually outflank the enemy. So I just sort of wanted to bring that preliminary battle report from Michigan into this, and we hope over the coming weeks we'll have similar reports from Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and the rest of the country.